Hi, I'm Annie Fitzsimmons. I'm your Washington Realtors legal hotline lawyer. This is an episode in our DBrief series entitled Thriving Through an Audit. And I am once again joined by two of our amazing DOL staff folks, Bill Dutra and Cathy McDonald. Brief introductions of who you are.
So I work with the Department of Licensing. I work with our division. I'm fortunate enough I get to work with all of our different professions that we license and regulate, but especially I get to work with our licensing partners like Washington Realtors and trying to help people be proactive in their duties as real estate brokers.
Excellent. And Cathy, who are you?
I am Cathy McDonald. I am the Audit Supervisor for the real estate program.
And thank you both for being here. In this episode, we are going to talk again. This is for designated brokers. This content is for designated brokers, more specifically than brokers in general. And what we want to talk about in this episode is proper folder, that would be transaction folder, proper transaction folder management. So what we're not going to talk about is all the documents that have to go into a transaction folder or when they have to be submitted, because we're saving that for a series, for an episode that is going to be customized for your brokers, not just you. But we do need some background information about what is a transaction folder. Who wants to describe what is a transaction folder?
I can do that. So a transaction folder basically is the file that is maintained for the individual transaction. It is something that is expected to be retained by the designated broker. They're responsible for the safekeeping of it, the retention of it. They need to be retained for a minimum of 3 years. However, a lot of people keep them longer than that, but that's what the expectation of DOL requirement is 3 years. In that folder should be everything. Like Annie said, we'll talk about that later, more detail. But as far as the folder itself, it really is just everything that the licensee submits to you. And then the licensee has the obligation to submit it. The designated broker has the obligation to retain it. And that's really about it that I can think of. Is there something specific you're looking for,
so
Annie?
when an auditor walks in the office, what's the requirement of the designated broker with respect to accessing that transaction folder?
So the expectation is that they are readily accessible and retrievable. So in other words, they don't have to go look for it. They don't have to dig around on their computer for 2 hours to try and figure out how to access it. One of the things that we tell the licensees commonly is if you're using software, know how to use it. A lot of times they don't print or don't pull things into a PDF format like they used to, and so they have trouble just getting the documents that we need because it's not something they do on a daily basis. So one of the things that we tell them is be prepared, know how you're going to provide those records to the auditor, because we're not going to wait and wait and wait. The first thing we ask for is a log, and then they select what folders they're going to look for. So the log of all the agreements and contracts that they're required to retain for all of their real estate activities. And then the auditor will then select a sampling from their log of the files that they want to look at, and they'll expect to see those files in their entirety.
Okay. And so when you say accessible, that means that they can say to the auditor, okay, we'll come back in 3 days and I'll have the folder for you.
So in the remote environment, there are benefits of the remote audit process. It used to be in person, we expected them to walk down the hall and hand them to us immediately. Now, when we do the audit process remotely, they're given 2 business days to provide us the log upon our request. And then once they provide us the log, then the auditor will make an additional request for which transaction files they would like to look at, and they'll be given 5 business days to provide those.
Okay. Are the requirements for file management, folder management, any different if folders are maintained physically versus electronically?
No, it's exactly the same. And the best thing I can tell people is if it exists, you should retain it.
Okay. So one of the questions that I get on the hotline is if we are storing our folders electronically, are we required to keep a physical copy for any amount of time?
No, everything can be retained electronically or hard copy, whichever you prefer. Some people do both, but we do not require that. And so there is a possibility, back when we were doing them in person, there were people that were electronic and they would have to print for the purpose of the audit. So now for the purpose of audit, they've got to be able to send their documents in the form of an attachment. So in some kind of a PDF, alterable format that they send to us, so we can see that that's how they're being maintained.
And you mentioned the 3-year time period, and you also mentioned that a lot of firms hold it for more than 3 years. Some lawyers are going to advise their firms to retain folders for longer than 3 years. That's something you should talk to your lawyer about. That's not something the Department of Licensing is going to tell you other than the 3-year time period. Does the department have anything to do with ensuring that the designated brokers of firms are protecting the confidentiality of their client within the folder retention? Is that something that you all do or not?
It's not really addressed specifically, unless I'm missing something. I don't believe so. We expect them to safekeep the records. We expect things to be confidential. I'm not honestly sure in the RCWs, the WACs, anywhere where that is specifically addressed. Bill, do you know of anywhere where that is specifically addressed?
So brokers and firms have duties that cannot be waived under the agency law.
Exactly.
They must maintain confidentiality of their records. They must maintain confidentiality of when they're working through these transactions. They must use reasonable skill and care. So that still comes into play with maintaining records. We would really hope that they have a manner of not putting the records out on the web for everybody to look at accidentally.
Yeah, there's just not anything specifically that talks about file retention and confidentiality.
Okay.
We have confidentiality on a more broader scale, but not specifically.
So
to
what I just heard you saying then is that the nature of file retention with respect to maintaining confidences is not something you're auditing for. But if there's a complaint,
Yes.
then certainly firms are required to maintain transaction folders so that client confidences are protected. And that could become a problem in the face of an investigation or litigation, but it's not something that's audited for on a routine
Correct.
audit. That's great. I understand that. Before we leave this episode, I want to pick up a little bit more on the notion of the transaction log, because that's not specifically covered in what we're planning on talking about in our debrief series, but it's absolutely critical to designated brokers that they understand the importance of maintaining a transaction log. So can one of you speak real quickly before we leave this episode to the nature of a transaction log, what it should include, and what you expect designated brokers to do on behalf of their firms with respect to the transaction log?
Okay, sure. So it's the requirement is that the firm has a log of all contracts and agreements of the firm, right? So what we expect to see on that log is everything, whether it's listings, whether it's sales, whether it's leases, whether it's property management agreements, referral agreements, BPOs, anything that is a contract or an agreement is expected to be on the log. We don't dictate how the log looks. Obviously, a log by itself dictates it's chronological, right? So it's a chronological listing. But we don't say you have to have 5 logs or that all of them can't be on the same log. So you could put every type of contract on one log. We would ask that then it would be notated as to what type of an agreement is if all different types of activities are on one log. Some firms keep a log of listings and a log of sales and a log of miscellaneous things. And it just kind of depends on what their business model is. The way the requirement is written is very vague. It just says that they must keep a log of all agreements and contracts of the firm. So we don't have any specifics that are required to be on the log itself. With common sense, we look at it from the standpoint of obviously a date and then a way to identify the contract, whether that's by address, client name, whatever, somehow to identify the contract. And if all the contracts are on one log, then what type of a contract is it? There's things on there that are really helpful for us if they put them on there, like the agent's name is awesome, but we can't require them to do that. I mean, there are things that are helpful. But a lot of times the log is more of a tool for the designated brokers. So most of them we see have much information on them. Like they'll have lots of things, prices, address, name of the buyer, name of the seller, name of the agent, because they use it as a tool. And that's what most firms do. We use it to select the files that we're going to going to review, but we also use it to determine the volume of business that the licensee is engaging in and the type of business that the licensee is engaging in. So what services are they providing? And then that's how we determine what we need to ask for as far as records and documents to conduct the audit. So the log can tell us a lot. I don't want to say more is better, but sometimes it is. But as far as us, it's great if it's functional for the designated broker, while at the same time we can use it as a tool to determine what kind of business they're engaging in and, what files we want to look at. So it really can work for both sides.
And one thing I want to add to what Cathy just said, just to be really clear, especially with some of the changes in law that took effect on January 1st, 2024, when you say or transaction log, that includes agency agreements. So if there's a listing that's taken even before it's sold, that listing agreement has to be included in the transaction log. If there's a buyer agency agreement, even if that buyer never ever purchases through the firm, there should be an entry in the transaction log for that buyer agency agreement.
All brokerage service agreements.
And then transaction documents.
Mm-hmm.
And we'll talk again a little bit more about what is a transaction when we get to the episode that's tailored towards your brokers. One more thing before we leave the topic of transaction log, I think it's important to say, because you said that every transaction has to be identified on there. Now, designated broker listening to this might say, well, if the purpose of the transaction log is for the auditor to walk into my office and say, show me your transaction log so I can pick files to audit, it would behoove me as a designated broker, if I have a troublesome transaction, don't put it on the transaction log. So I think it's important to identify that if there is a complaint that's filed or litigation that's started and the Department of Licensing has any investigative action with respect to that transaction, one of the first things you're going to ask for is show us the transaction log where that transaction was entered in chronological order in that transaction log. Is that right?
Certainly. So when we conduct an investigation, we're asking for all records relevant, plus transaction logs when it's necessary, everything. So it is very important to have that on there. I don't want anybody to come away thinking that I can just hide it, because eventually we find it. Mm-hmm. It's easy. We work backwards. When we do an investigation, we're working backwards. Brokers, DBs, you're acting in the moment going forward, but it's easy for us to go backwards and find out what's not there.
Monday morning quarterbacking?
Yeah, absolutely. That's what it is.
I think this is going to be the theme for this video series. Designated brokers. DOL, for everything that Cathy and Bill are going to say in this video series and the Friday video series, every bit of investigation that the Department of Licensing ever engages in, they start with the problem and work backwards to find out who made the mistake, when it was made, and who made it, what the mistake was. Sorry, I'm not trying to be disrespectful here, but that's a lot easier than your job, designated broker, which is to sit at the front end before a problem has come up and anticipate what you need to do to avoid those problems from arising in the first place. And so what we have learned in this video series is that designated brokers, you need to have really clear instruction to your brokers about the importance of the transaction log, what their role is with respect to completing the transaction log, making entries into that transaction log. And then we haven't talked about it yet, but there's submission of documents so that you can then properly maintain the transaction folder. That's what we've covered in this episode. And so designated brokers, it all starts with you. Only you can set up the mechanisms that then allow your brokers to be in compliance. And only you can provide the education that helps the brokers understand what they have to do to be in compliance. If you have questions on this topic or any other, please send a question to me at warealtor.org. Thank you for being a Washington Realtors member.